Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming out in such numbers. I realised that it was speaking in Cardiff in the April of '96, some months after the statement had been first published, and I was speaking in Cardiff, and Tony Blair was speaking in Swansea, and Alistair Campbell got extremely agitated because the audience to hear the author of the state we're in was twice as big as the putative Prime Minister. And I'd never forget it. I mean, it was an extraordinary moment where you thought, God, you know, my ramblings have caught the imagination of others than me. So I wonder whether what I'm going to say this evening will also catch your imagination. Because 20 years on, I'm not a happy bunny. Many of the concerns that I expressed 20 years ago when I wrote that book, and I mean, the print run was 3,500 for the first edition of The State We're In. It went on to sell over 300,000 copies. Amazed me and amazed everybody else. But the kind of things I talked about, and the reason why I think it sold so well, was because there was an appetite for change. And some of the things that I was talking about spoke to people's lived experience. And I was worried in the mid-1990s about geographial and intergenerational inequality, which I thought was likely to get worse. 8 of the poorest regions in Northern Europe are now in England, actually not interestingly in Wales, but in England. And everybody knows the gap between the well-off over 55-year-olds and the under 30s with plunging real wages and a negligible chance for many of them of buying a flat or a house. I was worried about trends in productivity growth, which I thought, if levels of investment carried on as they were likely to stagnate. Since the financial crisis, productivity has not grown at all. I was worried about the priorities of the financial system in general and the asset management industry in particular, and the very high rates of return over a very short period that they were acquiring from British companies. And the front page of the Financial Times has 50 business leaders actually saying just that in 2017. And actually business investment has risen just 4% from the troughs of the financial crisis in 2008. We are living through a kind of an investment drought, productivity stagnation, geographical and intergenerational inequality, and of course a current account on the balance of payments, which I was also worried about 20 years ago, that actually 5% of GDP, on the trade balance 7% of GDP. These are numbers which, if they continue in 10 years' time, will really make paying our way in the world, you know, close to impossible. And I was worried enough about all that, and then what happened on June the 23rd of last year. Now, I interpret the Brexit vote slightly differently from many. I interpret it as the biggest protest vote in a Western democracy since 1945. Of course, there were concerns about immigration. Of course, there were concerns about sovereignty. But we all know that actually the promises that were made by the Leave campaign don't stand up to scrutiny a year later. It is, of course, risible to leave the greatest free trading area in the world with 42 free trade agreements to embrace something called Global Britain when we are led to believe there's going to be sweetheart deals from Donald Trump, President Xi, and Mr. Modi in India. We already know that the Indians have said we notice that actually at the moment you take 175,000 immigrants a year from the European Union. When you stop taking them, we're looking forward to replacing them with immigrants from India, and that will be our starting point in our free trade agreement. So if you voted Leave in Merthyr Tydfil, hoping that to vote Leave was going to stop the flow of immigrants, you will be sadly abused. Your choice will be either to not be part of global Britain, with all that means for our economic growth, or to accept exactly the same levels of immigration as we did beforehand. And it's also clear that the £350 billion that was going to be spent on the National Health Service every week is a chimera. And so it goes on. We were sold a false prospectus in June the 23rd of last year, but people voted for the false prospectus, and many of them knew they were voting for a false prospectus. And the reason why they did was because the status quo for many of them is intolerable. In 2018, there are 190 countries in the world, around 190. According to the IMF and the World Bank, only 6 are not going to grow. 2018 is going to be a world non-inflationary boom. And Britain is expected, in this environment, to grow by 1% or less, warns the OECD in Paris. And everybody in this room knows why. It's because no company can invest, no company can expect, no inward investor is going to make a decision to come in here, because nobody knows the trading framework in which this country is going to operate in the next decade. And that's going to continue that uncertainty. There's no free trade agreement with the European Union possible if we leave the European Union that can allow us to remain in the single market and the customs union, because the Europeans can't allow us to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries so that we will become a kind of backdoor way of undermining their product standards and regulations by goods coming in, and they can ship out in the same way. And they're not going to cut that deal. And because everybody knows it, already you're seeing no regret decisions being made about not investing in our country. And on top of that, the kind of money that we're going to have to kind of spend to get any kind of reasonable exit won't, in the macro terms, make much difference. But it will make a difference in this respect, in that parts of the country that did well out of the kind of flows of regional funds coming out of Brussels are not going to get that money, even as we're carrying on paying into the European Union.